Hello and welcome. I'm your host Petri, and this show helps you to build your company. This episode is packed with entrepreneurial goodies. Erik Byrenius talks about his first startup that he was bootstrapping with his co-founders. The journey was full of pizzas, but also hardware, international expansion, mergers and acquisitions, and finally some exit suspense. We also cover angel investing, food tech, and impact investing. Let's get started. How does it feel to sleep in a car?
Oh, it's cold, but you sleep like a baby. You wake up in the middle of the night screaming and wondering where you are. But it's a good experience because you learn that some things are more important than others, and the bed is really nice.
I thought it's too cold in the Nordics to sleep in the car. In the US, they do that. But how do you do that in Sweden?
You can't really do it in the winter, I guess. So when I slept in the car, that was when I was running my own startup and I totally bootstrapped. Me and my co-founders, we went on sales trips to meet restaurants to try to sell them an online ordering system so we could put them on our marketplace. And we couldn't afford to stay at a hotel or a hostel. So we had to find a way to bootstrap. And one way was, of course, to sleep in the car. And we tried to get free food as well, which wasn't that difficult because we sold to restaurants and all the restaurants wanted to show us that they had the best pizza or kebab or salad or falafel in the city. So we were offered more free food than we could take.
What was first? Pizza, you wanted to eat pizza, the business, or what is there some, crazy story why you decided to focus on pizzas?
It's always your own need first, right? So food was number one. It all started that me and my co-founders, we were slightly hungover a Sunday while we were studying at university in Sweden, in the city of Linköping. We wanted to order pizza, but we didn't have any cash. We used all of it the evening before, apparently. We didn't remember, but obviously that was the case. So we wanted somehow to be able to pay by card, and we didn't really want to go to the restaurant to pick it up. We wanted to have it home delivered. Of course, we realized that this wasn't possible. This was back in 2005. So it was pre-Facebook, pre-smartphones. So we decided to try to build that service ourselves, which later became what we in Sweden called online pizza, and it's now under the name Foodora.
There was a previous episode where Elias Aalto, a co-founder of Volt, was referring to you. He was saying that we thought we were up against basically pizza online, which was back then very web-focused and early 2000 kind of product. And then he goes on talking about that they are a mobile-first company. But, to listen to more of that episode, check it out yourself. But so was there anyone else doing that? Or you were pretty much the first one in the market? You came to Finland and other markets as well.
We're the first ones in Sweden. There was one company that had just started in Denmark called Just Eat, which is now a UK-based company. I don't think there was anyone in Europe, as I can remember at least. So we were starting out. We could look up to Just Eat as role models, but they were so early, so we basically had to invent everything ourselves. What we did see was there were some attempts to try to do something online for restaurants, but nothing that was built into a marketplace and nothing that worked that you could order from. So we saw that others had the idea, which sort of encouraged us that maybe it's not that stupid after all. And you have to remember that this was 2005, so online ordering in general was very immature. I think the only kinds of products that you could order then was like books, and some things related to travel, like hotel rooms and flights. I think you could book online, but that was about it. Ordering anything else online was weird.
I can imagine that there was no iPhones. Basically, even paying something online wasn't that easy, and getting orders and getting restaurants in there, a lot of hurdles. The stack was not really where it's today, so it might be even for some people quite difficult to think, all the obstacles you've been going through at the time.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it was so early days, so it wasn't just about the consumer behavior that wasn't there already. It was also about how you build a business. There was no startup ecosystem. There wasn't a horde of angel investors you could approach. We didn't have entrepreneurial role models to look up to. who had been in the similar space before. We didn't have like extensive framework for how to develop an e-commerce site. That was basically how we started out. We spent the first 5 to 6 weeks learning how to build an e-commerce site and getting it online, and writing everything from scratch. Of course, everything ended up as terrible spaghetti code that no one else than me and my co-founders could understand, and possibly not even us in the end. So everything was a hustle. And I'm so happy for entrepreneurs nowadays, where there are so many things that you could just use as a foundation when building a startup, and you have lots of guides, you have lots of events, you can meet other entrepreneurs, you can learn from them. It's just a total different ecosystem today. And I'm so grateful for everyone else who can leverage that.
How did you get traction? Because you needed to sign up, obviously, the end users, the hungry students, or whoever were the first ones to get to the system, but also the restaurants. I don't think you had a delivery as a third component, or did you?
No, initially we didn't. So it started as, to put it simply, like we spent slightly more than a month just learning how to code and developing a very rudimentary online ordering platform. Then we spent 1 month going around to restaurants locally and trying to convince them that it's a good idea to be online. That was very, very hard, but eventually we managed to convince the 3 or 4 restaurants locally in the city where we lived. When we had those signed up, then luckily for us, it was about time to go back to school in August, after the first summer that we spent building the company. So we went back to school and brought some flyers that we printed on the school printers, and we started handing them out to students. We just assumed that since we were students and wanted the service, then hopefully there are other students who also like this service. So we started spreading the word by flyers, and it worked. It wasn't like an overnight success in any way, but like after a few days, we saw that we had the first order from someone we didn't know. It wasn't one of our friends that we forced to order. Eventually, it picked up speed. It was really a very simple approach to how to get traction. You tell people about the service, and then you sit around and wait and hope for them to order.
When was this exactly? I'm just starting to think about Facebook and the early days in the campus. It sounded like a sort of a bit of similar type of.
I wish I could compare ourselves to Facebook. Thank you, Petri, for bringing that up. But I'm not. Of course, there are some similarities in terms of starting on the campus, but I think that goes for a lot of different businesses worldwide. That going to students is usually less difficult path than trying to access another user base somewhere. Students are relatively easy to find because they go to campus every day. They are usually slightly more open for trying new things. And especially if the product was developed by their peer students, then it's easier to convince at least a few of them to try. So naturally, that was a good step for us to try, and it worked then, and it also turned out that later during the years that student was a very important customer group of ours.
You had some trouble, obviously, as well. So you were first fully digital, even though I guess you needed to build quite a lot of things yourself. But then you started to do something in a hardware space as well. Why was that?
Oh, the hardware. Yeah. Well, so what happened was that we started this in the city where we lived. We could do everything digital. It kind of worked. It started growing. When we went back to school in August after the first summer, we didn't have much time to spend. Of course, we spent evenings and weekends, but that wasn't enough really to grow the business as fast as we wanted to. So we decided to spend the next summer, 2006, trying to expand to new cities. So we decided to go around to restaurants in other student cities with big campuses in Sweden and try to convince them to join, and then copy what we did in Linköping, to start with restaurants and then go to campus and start handing out flyers. It totally failed. I think we had 100 or 150 meetings with restaurants that summer, and I think we signed one.
Wow.
We couldn't really figure out why it was so different from Linköping. but eventually understood that the restaurants felt it was too complicated, with them having to get a computer, getting an internet connection. And it was still 2006. So it was like, at least in Sweden, it was rather uncommon with small businesses having their own internet connection at the time. So we had to help them getting a computer. We had to help them get an internet connection. And probably they didn't always want to tell us, but they thought it was perhaps too complicated and a little scary, to be honest. So we didn't always get the true reason why they didn't want to join. But we eventually understood that the complicated internet setup was definitely part of it. So we realized that we have to find another way to get the orders into the restaurants. We can't expect them to have a computer. And also for us, we learned from Linköping that even if we help them get a computer, then we end up as IT support for the restaurants. And we get a call Friday night when someone working at a restaurant can play a game at their Windows machine. So it wasn't like the ideal setup for us either. We wanted to be a online food ordering company, not the IT support company for restaurants. So we decided to try a few different ways to get order into restaurants. We tried, I mean, obviously this was before smartphones. We couldn't just get a smartphone or an iPad or something. So we had to come up with something else. We tried giving them a mobile phone so you can send text messages, but obviously text messages are very brief and it's hard to get a big order over text message. So it just led to failed orders. We tried using a fax machine. It sounds crazy today, but honestly, that was like the best solution we had for quite a while. We helped them get a fax machine. Yeah, we did. And I don't remember how long it was used for, but especially in Germany, where we later made some business through a partner, I know that they used fax machines quite broadly many years after the release of iPhones. So fax machines, I mean, they're not that bad from one perspective. I mean, you can send a full page or several pages. It's easy to read. There's an automatic printout. So it's not just a digital message that someone at a restaurant has to put down on paper and give to the kitchen. You don't get like a full confirmation, of course, that someone at the restaurant actually read the fax message you sent, but you do get a confirmation from the fax machine that it has received the message. So you somehow knew that probably they have received this message.
So it's not run out of paper.
Exactly. So, I mean, there were some of those risks, and that was one of the reasons why we couldn't keep going with fax machines, because we couldn't really know if they actually read it or not. And of course, for us, like one failed order was a disaster. We wanted it to be 100% success rate in delivering the orders. Otherwise, we'd lose trust from the consumers. So what we did was to try to sort of create our own fax machine that corrected all the flaws with fax machines. So we didn't want it to occupy the phone line when it was used. We wanted it to have some sort of bidirectional communication. So when the restaurant had received the message, they had to sort of push a button or something and give a delivery time. So we could show that to the end user and give them confidence that the restaurant has really seen your order, because they even said when it would be delivered. That was like the ideal step we wanted to reach. And we couldn't find anything on the market. So we were sort of thinking that, okay, so maybe it's not worth doing this. Maybe we're just too early. We have to wait until something comes along. But we were still studying. We didn't really have that much else to spend our time on. We thought it was really fun. So we said, okay, why not? Why don't we try to, instead of just closing down the business, why don't we try to build something? Then we'll learn something more. Maybe the option wasn't really to just focus on running a digital business. The option was to stop running a business because we couldn't keep going the way we did.
So this was like 2 years in.
So this was autumn 2006, after our very failed sales summer. That was when we realized that we have to build something. And then we started Googling Luckily, Google was there, so we did get some support. We realized that there were different kinds of hardware components we could put together probably somehow. We just started ordering what we found online, and in the end, after months of trying, we realized how hardware works and how programming hardware works. And eventually, we did create something that became a ordering terminal that we could put at restaurant. They just plugged it into the socket, and we could send orders wirelessly through the mobile network. It was basically a order terminal with a mobile a mobile modem inside using GPRS to transfer data. We put a SIM card inside. We put a small speaker inside so we could let the restaurant know when there was an order. We built in a receipt printer, a very small printer that could print the order for the restaurant, so they didn't have to type it on paper themselves. And we attached some buttons so they could reply and say that we will have a 30 or 40 minutes delivery time today. And that totally changed the business for us. All of a sudden, from being those complicated dudes going to restaurants and asking them to get engaged in internet and computers, we were the ones coming with one piece of hardware and saying, if you take this piece of hardware, you put it on your counter and you plug it in, it won't occupy your phone line or anything, then you will just get more orders, and we only charge you per additional order you get. So that was a no-brainer for restaurants to try, at least. And that was sort of the turning point for us, from being close to closing the business to realizing that, wow, this really works. Now it's just about scaling. That was a eureka moment for us.
Until that point, at least, you were bootstrapping, so there was no external investors.
True. So we invested ourselves about $8 every month, the three founders. So we had $240 per month. That was our burn rate for the first 3 years, basically. Then, of course, we started generating some revenue, so you could use that as well.
But you needed to build the hardware as well. Isn't that kind of expensive?
So the hardware, I mean, we saved for a few months. We saved those $240 for 3 months before we could order the components we needed to build the first version. And then what we did was we didn't charge the restaurants. The restaurants didn't have to buy the hardware from us. They could borrow it, but they had to leave a deposit. So they left a deposit of, don't remember exactly, let's say $300. But the hardware only cost us like $200 to build. And of course, we promised them that you can, like any day, you can call us and say, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I want my money back, and I'll give the hardware back to you. That was, of course, the promise to restaurants. But of course, when we received the money from the restaurants, we used that to order more hardware so we could build for the next restaurants. And all of a sudden, we're in a situation that if like 10 or 15 of the restaurants would call us at the same day and say, we want our money back, it wouldn't be possible because we used all that money to buy new hardware. So our bet was completely upon being able to deliver value to the restaurants. Otherwise, we would fail from one day to the next. So from that perspective, okay, hardware wasn't that expensive. It was a few $100s per piece, and we could finance it by revenues, or in this case, deposits from the restaurants. But I mean, you're definitely right that if we would have had more external money somehow, then we could have grown much faster, because then we could have ordered much more hardware and we probably had lower prices on our hardware. But we didn't really need that because we were also limited by our own time. We were still studying. We couldn't spend all the time going around to restaurants selling. So we were anyway limited in how fast we could sell and scale up and add new restaurants to the system. And we couldn't spend the time we needed to do marketing anyway. So it was kind of okay for us to grow slowly. Of course, if we would have started a business like in today's climate, we would surely have had investments early on from angels. And we would have probably quit our studies to focus full time much earlier than we did. But for us, it worked okay.
So how did you scale? How did you manage to get new restaurant, new cities, and eventually you started to, I think, also do a bit of acquisitions and go to abroad as well?
Yeah. So we the first scaling in Sweden, we did basically the way I already described in terms of ourselves going around to different cities, knocking at doors, sleeping in the car, eating free food at restaurants, um, still bootstrapping. That worked pretty well. And of course, after a while, our name, Online Pizza in Sweden, became more well known among restaurants and consumers, of course, but especially restaurants. So then all of a sudden it started becoming possible to sell by phone as well. We didn't need to visit all restaurants because they already understood how the concept worked because they read about it somewhere or they knew someone who used us. So then we started scaling a little bit faster. And that was about the time when we also realized that it can't just be the three of us founders. So we started recruiting people, both in customer care, people helping us with like entering all the menus and delivery data into the system, and of course salespeople as well. So then we started scaling, and of course, like when when you start scaling in terms of employees, then also the business goes faster, and then we could scale even faster. And at some point, we realized that okay, this is going really well in Sweden now. We should try to like focus on going international as well. And that was when we started looking into acquisitions and mergers in other markets. It's a bit funny, but I think when you explain something in retrospect, it sounds like everything was so clear and strategic. But I think, like most entrepreneurs know, it's never like that. You're being very opportunistic, and you change your mind from week to week because you learn new things. And for us, like when we started international expansion, the plan wasn't really to do any mergers or acquisitions. The plan was just to make a brief market analysis of all the countries in Europe and close to Europe, realize which countries are the best, and then we'll just launch in those countries. Sounds so simple. And of course, it wasn't so hard to make a market analysis and see where do we have e-commerce growing quickly, where do we have a card payment growing quickly. But when you know which country is on top of the list, if I remember correctly, I think Greece was really high on the list for us. I think that was the number one priority. Okay, so we know that we want to launch in Greece, but how do you do that? How do you launch in Greece? We can't just sit on our office in Sweden and run a Greek business. We need to find local people. Okay, so how do you find a country manager for Greece? If you don't have the network, you've only been students living in Sweden, all of you, it's really hard. Do you put an ad on a job board somewhere saying, hey, we need a country manager for this online food ordering business? Probably won't work, probably won't find the right people. So what we realized after a while was that we have to think the other way around. We have to start looking for people in like any of the top 15 European markets on our list. Then when we find the right people, then we decide which countries to go to. And that was also what led us to doing some acquisitions in other markets, because we realized that maybe the right people to run our business were people who had recently started building their own similar business, because they sort of understood the business already, they believed in the market, but maybe they didn't have the resources to grow quickly, and they most surely didn't have the hardware terminal that we had developed. So if we could invest in them or acquire them somehow, they could use our technology, then it was just a win-win. So that was sort of how they ended up. But to be honest, it wasn't planned. We learned along the way.
Do you remember what was the first acquisition you did? How old was the company? What was your revenues, and how many people you have? Sort of how early you were?
I mean, in the end, we didn't do that many acquisitions. So what happened was, the first international expansion we did was to Poland, where we found a Swedish-Polish entrepreneur who we tried to convince for a while to run this business. The problem was he was living in Sweden at the time, and he had no interest going to Poland. We thought it was brilliant. You speak Polish, you have lived in Poland. It's of course, you go to Poland and you start this business. He didn't really understand why he would go to Poland. He was living in Sweden. We didn't really understand each other there. But after after a few months, maybe up to a year, he got back to us and said, "Hey, I met a girlfriend. She lives in Poland. Do you still want me to run a Polish business?" And we were like, "Oh, okay, yeah, for sure, let's do it." So that's how we started in Poland. But then we realized that this process was also quite complicated, just to try to find the right people and start from scratch. So after launching in Poland, we said that, okay, let's see if we can find acquisition targets instead. The first one we did, to be honest, I'm not sure which country it was, but it was either Finland or Austria, because those were the two next markets where we launched via not full-scale acquisitions, but in first step as investments, and we later acquired those companies.
Can you give some tips or hints of experience for those who are thinking, or maybe now starting to think about it? Maybe I should actually start to do acquisitions instead of building everything from scratch.
That's a good question. I think what we learned was that we were very happy that we didn't fully acquire the businesses, because then that would mean so much more overhead for us at the headquarters. We would need to probably find new people to run the businesses if we would fully acquire them. We wanted the local entrepreneurs to have very strong incentives. So we want them to still have the majority in the companies. Of course, we had a shareholders agreement, so we still had some vetoes and some control, but we wanted the entrepreneurs to have a huge financial upside. We want them to feel that it's still their company. Just going in and acquiring something is in my view, very complicated, and you need a strong organization to be able to actually make use of that acquisition. There's a big risk that the business loses value if you don't take care of it properly after the acquisition. It usually looks better on paper than in practice after acquisition. So that's something I would be careful about, really thinking, how will we run this business afterwards? There's a difference between if you run a business like ours, where you need strong local presence. In those cases, it's obvious that you need a strong local team. Of course, there are other kinds of acquisitions where you don't really want the team. You're more looking for some assets. Maybe you have a global business where you sell software online, and then it doesn't really matter. Maybe you don't need a team. Maybe you just want to buy the customer list or the IP. And then, of course, it's different. Then it's more easy to incorporate that into your own business, I would assume. It's also easy to start doing it prematurely. You need to understand your own business. You need to understand the market well before you start acquiring others. Otherwise, you won't know how to incorporate them in the best way. I think we were lucky in the way that we had spent several years bootstrapping ourselves, learning a lot about how to run this business at the detailed level. We didn't acquire anything that we didn't understand. We understood completely exactly where they were, what they needed. We could look into their metrics and see that they should be able to improve that metric by 10%. And we could also learn that they're really good at that metric, and we could probably improve 5% on that metric. If we would have had totally different businesses, but just sharing some sort of customer groups, then it would have been much more difficult. But since we acquired more or less identical businesses to ours, it was easy for us to understand.
What was the process of convincing other entrepreneurs to join forces? Because I would assume that quite many of them have ideas that they're building their business and they don't need anyone else, and maybe they were not even thinking of anything along the lines of joining forces.
I think the key for us was this hardware box that we had, and potentially that we could also invest some capital in the businesses, because the acquisitions we made in Finland and Austria, they were still in the early days. It was before the bigger startup hype. It was still pretty hard to attract investors to that kind of business. For us, coming with the hardware box and showing them how it worked, showing that it really helped us scale in Sweden and Poland. And of course, also being able to inject some capital in the business, I think that was very tempting. I would guess that those entrepreneurs, you should ask them, but I guess that those entrepreneurs considered us to be sort of a helping hand along their journey of building their business.
It sounded like you more like hardware company than actually a direct competitor?
On a global level, we were strong competitors. So if I would guess that if any of the entrepreneurs that we approach for acquisitions, if they would have a global target, then probably it wasn't the best strategy to have us on board. But if they were more focused on building a strong local business in their country and possibly neighboring countries, then us running a business in Sweden or Poland didn't matter. Then it was just better for them to be part of something bigger, where we could learn from each other and use money more efficiently.
Was there some markets you wanted to enter, but you didn't find good acquisition targets or the cooperation partners, or you were just flat out maybe outed from the market by other competitors? Or
when we did our market analysis, of course, we also based that partly on how strong local competition was. Luckily for us, the competition was very weak in almost all markets. There were a few players that had popped up in a few markets, but it didn't really limit us that much. There were so many more completely open markets to attack. I mentioned Greece, that was one of the countries very high up on our list, but where we just couldn't find the right team or entrepreneurs, and we couldn't find anyone else who did it in Greece already. So that was a market that would have liked to do, but we couldn't at the time. After we had made acquisitions in Finland and Austria, we started looking for new markets, new bigger markets after that. We became market leaders in all our 4 markets, but we also felt that if we're going to take another market, it should be a much bigger market. We started looking into especially China and South Korea as possible next steps that would make a big difference for the company. But of course, it's hard to find the right team in those countries. We were a little more mature ourselves as a team and an organization at the time. We're probably about 100 people in our 4 countries. And we had some better network and some more capital. So we had some more resources trying to find the right people. But this was about at the same time as we started thinking about being acquired. It wasn't so much about us planning that. It was more about 2 other players on the market being interested in acquiring us at the same time. So while we're thinking about either we decline those acquisition offers and we go all in on one new big market, or we start discussing with these potential acquirers to see if this is a good timing for us to exit. So it wasn't really planned, but we realized that having two of the biggest players in the world in our space who wanted to acquire us at the same time put us in a very good negotiation position.
Can you name those who were interested?
Yeah, sure. So one was the previous Danish company I mentioned, Just Eat, which at that time was a UK company. They were the biggest ones in Europe at the time, and they had, to make a long story short, they had also invested in us before, and they were in our board. So we were already somehow partners with them. They knew everything about our business almost. They felt that it's probably about time to acquire you by now before we grow too big for them. And at the same time, we were also partners, and we had made a small investment in German Delivery Hero when they started up in 2010. So it was all the major players in Europe were really interconnected. It's quite complicated. Us investing in Just Eat's worst competitors while Just Eat was in our board, that was complicated.
What was the reason behind that? Was it sort of some kind of hedging or some, keep your enemies closer type of thing?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. From Just Eat perspective, investing in us, to be honest, I don't think they would ever confirm it, but I think it was a way out for them initially when it first happened. Because they had launched in Sweden in our early days, and we were fighting head to head with them in southern Sweden, especially. They were running some of their operations from Denmark. We were running it from Stockholm and Linköping at the time. So we were really fighting hard with them. They had all the capital they needed. They were well funded at the time. They had experience. They also had a hardware solution quite similar to ours. But they didn't have a strong Swedish team. So they tried to do it mostly from Denmark. We were fighting that big giant with like energy, passion, and trying to innovate all the time. And in the end, I would say it was too hard for them to succeed in Sweden because they didn't find the right team, and they had to somehow explain to the world and to their shareholders what happened in Sweden. I think they couldn't really say that we just failed. We lost to these 3 students who didn't have any money, any experience, or time. So they had to find a way out, and their way out was to accept to invest in us because we really need the capital at that time to go international. So we accepted investments. We accepted their investment, and they sort of got a strategic stake in our business. And then when Delivery Hero decided to start up slightly later in Berlin, we knew the team from before, and they sort of learned a bit from us about how to run the business. And we strongly believe that this team will be able to build something big. They had a slightly different strategy to ours. They really had a land grab strategy, growing as quickly as possible, raising a lot of money, which wasn't very suitable for us. We were much more focused on building strong presence, becoming market leaders, driving revenue, reaching profitability. So we had quite different ways of running the businesses, but we realized that they would probably succeed with their strategy. So then we thought it was better to keep them close. So we did a symbolic tiny investment in them, partly so they could show to other investors that these online pizza guys, they believe in us. They have even invested in us, even though we would eventually somehow globally become competitors. So I think it really helped them. We also licensed our hardware to them, so they could sort of get going quickly when they launched. And of course, this was a complicated thing with having Just Eat on board, because Just Eat also had partly a land grab strategy, so they would become more direct competitors with Delivery Hero.
How do you navigate all that? You obviously have some information you don't want to share with everyone, and everybody's competing with each other, and then you just all into sort of same board meetings maybe.
Yeah. How do you navigate that? It's I think maybe it sounds more complicated when you describe it later, because now it sounds like everything was so chaotic. But of course, at the time, and this was spread out over a couple of years, so we had a lot of time trying to understand what are the incentives of everyone, how are we working with everyone, what do we have to share, what are we legally obliged to share to a board member. So in the end, I would say that of course it was sort of complicated, but I think it was probably slightly less complicated for us than for Just Eat and Delivery Hero, because we were so different in our approach to scaling, since we focus so much on our core markets and building very, very strong footholds on those markets. And Just Eat and Delivery Hero were more direct competitors. So, I mean, of course, for us, having a competitor as shareholders and board members, it pushed us to really understand what does our shareholders agreement say? How can we adapt our shareholders agreement so we don't end up in a trap somewhere? But in the end, of course, it's business. It's about relationships in the end. Of course, we could have a shareholders agreement, but in the end, we had to make sure that no one felt that we were being hostile to them. And that's about building relationships. And I think that's something you must never forget, even if you end up in legal discussions, that in the end, the agreements are usually just a reflection of what you have anyway agreed upon. And the handshake is sometimes more important than what it actually says on paper.
When you wake up one Sunday morning and you want to exit your business, what's the button to push? I guess there's no Pizza Online box where you say that I want to exit now, please.
No, but the truth is we didn't really want to exit. It wasn't that we didn't want to, but we were definitely not looking for an exit at the time. We had probably realized by then that at some point in time we will make an exit. We are probably not the ones who will run this to a huge IPO and be global leaders. We'll probably make an exit someday. We already had a few acquisition offers that we declined. naturally. We had mentally accepted that at some point in time we would probably be acquired, but we also felt that we probably need to do this for a few more years before we will be in that position. But I think that what happened was that Delivery Hero had just raised even more money and decided to grow very quickly using M&A. They didn't want to start from scratch because it was too slow. So they wanted to do M&A in lots of markets at the same time. And their storytelling to their investors and to the market was that they were very early in a few huge markets. They were early in China. They were early in South Korea. They were had come some way in Germany and a few other European markets, but they also needed to show that they could be really profitable at some markets. So they could tell the story that, look, we're having these really profitable businesses in country XYZ, and then we have these other huge markets following the same trajectory, and in a few years they will eventually be at the same profitable level, and then will be super valuable. They wanted to sell that story, but then they needed the really profitable countries, which they didn't. So of course they looked around and see who are having some really profitable countries with nice margins. And to be honest, we were the only ones that even remotely could be acquired. So they started looking at our countries, especially Sweden and Finland, that were the most profitable countries, and realized that if they could tell their story and show that Sweden and Finland have these nice margins, then fundraising would be so much easier for them. They would also generate some revenue, so they didn't need to do as much fundraising. So I think that was the rationale why they more or less suddenly realized that we should acquire Online Pizza, the group of countries.
Did you realize at the time that you have leverage? Basically, you were the only one. So, you had that position when starting to go to the valuation and exit price.
We realized that it was probably important for them, yes. But I think even more, what was important for us in terms of leverage was that we had Just Eat as shareholders. We had a shareholders agreement that said that all shareholders have a right of first refusal, which means that if the other shareholders want to sell their shares to someone, then the existing shareholders have the first opportunity to buy those shares at the same terms as the third party offered to acquire the shares for. Which basically means that if we want to sell the company to Delivery Hero, then Just Eat would say, okay, but we'll do it instead on the same terms that Delivery Hero offered you. This meant that we could convince Delivery Hero that if you're going to make an offer on us, then there is no point doing it for a valuation that is rather low, because then Just Eat will just say, great, we'll take it. And then we would be legally obliged to sell to Just Eat, so we wouldn't have an option then. So there's no point for Delivery doing it unless they could put a valuation at a number that they thought that Just Eat wouldn't accept. Because that's the only way for Delivery to be able to acquire us at all. And they only had one shot. And if they missed, if they put a too low number, then Just Eat would just acquire it and they would lose the deal. And that would be the worst possible scenario for Delivery Hero. It would be Just Eat acquiring us.
That sounds so beautiful after.
Yeah, but it was beautiful. So I mean, that's one of the few things I'd say. It's not. It doesn't sound much better afterwards than it was at that time, because it was. I mean, we were obviously in a very nice spot at that time. So we were lucky in that. I mean, of course, we built a business that was sustainable and profitable, and we were not in a rush. So of course, that put us in a good position as well. But the specific timing of Delivery Hero being afraid of Just Eat acquiring us, and Delivery Hero needing us to show to tell their story. I mean, that was luck. So we could basically, without telling Just Eat, we could negotiate with Delivery Hero and push them to put a number that we together thought might be too expensive for Just Eat. It turned out that Just Eat didn't think it was expensive enough. So Just Eat said, eventually we received offer from Delivery Hero, so then we had to go to Just Eat and say, hey, okay, now we received this acquisition offer from Delivery Hero. Do you want to take it? Then Just Eat started thinking for a few days, and then they said, yes, we definitely want to take it. And then we thought, shit, we put the too low number. Not that it matters so much to us who would acquire us. That wasn't the big thing. It was more like we realized that, okay, we probably could have pushed this number higher. But then it was too late for negotiations. We had that number on paper. We told Just Eat that we have received this offer, which meant that according to our shareholders agreement, we had to sell to Just Eat at the same terms if they accepted it. That was the right. And they said, we take it. That gave them 60 days to complete a due diligence and to negotiate final purchase agreements with us. The offer from Delivery Hero was more like a term sheet saying that these are the headline terms, it's this valuation, it should complete in this time, and some other major, like how is it paid, and so on. But it didn't include like all the specific details on warranties and all that you put in the share purchase agreement. So Just Eat had to spend some time doing their final due diligence before the board would decide if they really wanted to acquire us or not, and negotiate the agreements with us. Just Eat were in a slightly difficult position at the time because they were just planning their own IPO, which meant that everything they did, especially big deals, had to be formally 100% correct and compliant in every way. They couldn't take the risk of like missing something in a due diligence that close to the IPO turned out to be a disaster, because that could ruin their own IPO. So they had to do a full, complete due diligence of us, even though we were still quite a small company. It was quite a small deal. I think it was $55 million deal. So it wasn't huge, but it was big enough for them to like having to do a proper DD. That took a lot of time. We were quite an unorganized company at the time. We had businesses in 4 countries. We had about 100 employees. We had never had a big formal investment from any VC before, so we hadn't went through a proper DD process. We didn't have our papers in order. So it took a lot of time for us and for them trying to finalize the DD. Eventually, they did complete the DD, but there was still, of course, some question marks that they didn't have time to dive into. There was like some question about VAT levels in Austria, if I remember correctly. It was like one of those things that they didn't have time to figure out. So in the end, they said, after 59 days, they said, okay, we need 3 more days. We need to figure this thing out. We can't sign the papers until we figure this out. But we're confident that we will, but we need to have it on paper before we sign. And we said, okay, but you have 60 days to sign the papers. We are ready. Just call us in the evening on day 60 and we'll just sign the papers. But eventually they never called. They said that it needed 1 or 2 more days. Of course, Delivery Hero knew this. So we said to Delivery Hero that, okay, now 60 days has passed. It's 1 a.m. in the night. We haven't had any phone calls from Just Eat. So now we're up for grabs. Then Delivery Hero flew in their management team from Berlin to Stockholm. We met 9 a.m. in the morning. They started doing their DD in parallel with negotiating the final share purchase agreement. So we had parallel tracks at the lawyer's office. It took some time, but compared to Just Eat's 60 plus days, after 21 hours, 6 a.m. the next morning, they were happy enough with what they found in the DD and with the share purchase agreement, and then they signed the papers. So by being super quick and entrepreneurial, and of course to some extent being willing to take some more risk because they couldn't finalize all the legal DD, they decided they trusted us. They'd worked with us for a while, not as long as Just Eat, but still long enough for them to understand that this is a good business. They could compare our metrics to their metrics. They didn't care so much about the legal details, more about the commercial details. Just Eat were much more focused on the legal aspects of things, not so much on the commercial. So they were just much quicker understanding that even if there would be some legal trouble somewhere, it doesn't matter so much to us.
Did you manage to do something with the price?
No, we couldn't. I mean, we're not allowed to. I mean, that's how the right of first refusal works. So we received the first offer from Delivery Hero, and then we had to show that to Just Eat. So we couldn't negotiate the price with Just Eat because we just had to show them what we had already accepted. Then after those 60 days, then if we would change anything in the terms, then we would have to go back to Just Eat again and say, okay, so now we have received this new offer. Now we have 60 more days. So we had to do everything on the same terms, not to lose the deal. So unfortunately, we couldn't leverage that, but we could instead leverage the situation with Delivery Hero to push them into having a very friendly share purchase agreement, because those details were not in the offer, the initial offer that we showed to Just Eat. So there were still some details to negotiate about, and we could get those very seller friendly. Like we would still have. They didn't have to pay everything up front because they didn't have the money. So they paid some up front, and then they paid some things like a year later. And then we could have like our whole company as collateral. So if they wouldn't pay, we'd just get the company back. And we didn't have a long lock-in. We had 6 months lock-in, which is quite short in that kind of business where the founders are still expected to run and grow the business for a long time. So we could negotiate some of those things, but not the price. So we ended up at 55 million, which compared to today's numbers is ridiculously low. But given where we were and where the state of the startup ecosystem was at that time, it was quite a lot, especially for us three founders who still own the majority of the company.
You went to school into university when you started, and was this your first job? And then you exited with quite a nice number from there.
Yeah, it was. So we started in university, and to be honest, I mean, I'd like to stress this, that starting a company while you are studying is probably the best time in your life when you can start a company, because you don't take a lot of risk, a lot of personal risk. In Sweden, at least, you can live decently on what you can get in terms of grants and loan for being a student. So we didn't need more income. We could take $80 per month and invest in the company instead. So that's a really good time. And if it fails, you just, okay, that's it. And you go back to focusing in your studies or start something new. So you don't take a lot of risk. So we did start during the study. That was the first attempt. I had been involved in other projects before, but nothing related to starting a business. And I had met my co-founders at the university while we were like active in student organizations. So we hadn't built a commercial business before, but we had worked on projects before, so we knew each other.
What happened after that? Again, a Sunday, but now you have a bit more money in the bank account and probably nothing to do.
Yeah, but I mean, it's yes. So I had money on the bank account, but still, that money was never the primary driver for running a business. It sounds like a cliche, possibly, and of course, I mean, I'm very well aware that money makes things so much easier, but it doesn't change so much in your passion and your day-to-day activities. I still wanted to see things grow. I still wanted to learn. I'm a curious person. I couldn't just sit around and like try to live off interest, right? That's. I mean, I would be depressed by doing that. So from that perspective, it doesn't change so much. And I stayed. I mean, I mentioned that we had 6 months lock-in from the buyer, but I stayed for almost 1.5 years in the business, trying to recruit new people to replace me and my co-founders, and making sure that those people learned the business before I left. The business was still my baby. I didn't want to leave, so I had a gradual phase out from the business. But eventually, of course, I started thinking about what to do next. Should I start a new business? In that case, what business? I made a list of different potential businesses that I wanted to start, but I also realized that I shouldn't just jump the gun and start something immediately. I should spend some time learning about the different markets, the different business models that I was curious on, and possibly like learn from other entrepreneurs who had different experiences than I had. So I started reaching out to entrepreneurs, asking them to tell me everything they knew about their market and their business models and learn from their backgrounds. Of course, they started asking, why should I spend my time doing that? So that strategy didn't work. But then I realized, but if I invest money, would you do it then? So then I became an angel investor, offering money, basically to learn. From that perspective, it's probably more for the money, but still that worked. So I became an angel investor to learn, while figuring out what is the next big step for me. What is my next business?
How many companies you been investing?
By now, about 50, I'd say. To be honest, I don't know the exact number. It's about 50.
So like 50 lessons to learn.
Yeah, I mean, you never learn everything you want to learn. But what I did realize was that it's so much fun doing investments because of all the learning you do. I started doing investment in 2013, a year after our exit. And I did realize that I enjoyed doing angel investments so much that 6 years later, I was still looking for the next thing to do myself. I had to confess to myself that I'm at least right now in this phase in life, I'm probably not going to start a new business. I'm probably going to spend more time on many different businesses. It was just a model that attracted me slightly more than starting my own business at the time. So at that time, I didn't have 50 investments, but I did realize that I have to do something more focused. So then I started looking at a few different side projects where I could spend some more time myself. And I started thinking about not only investing generally in software, that was my only focus at the time, but trying to be more niched somehow, because then I could learn more about the one or a few spaces that interested me even more.
What are your experiences and lessons learned from being an angel investor? I understood that you were also learning that process by doing and having different stages and steps and different approaches also to the investing.
Yeah, it's a good question. What I learned, I mean, you learn. I did this for so many years. So I learned so much. It's maybe hard to tell what was the learning from actually doing the angel investments and what was the learning from life itself. But one thing that's become more and more obvious to me is that I think all investors think that later stage investors, they lack conviction. Yourself, you see that, okay, this is the future. This is going to happen in a few years. So I have to invest now, and then when it's time for them to raise the next round, you think that later stage investors, they don't have the conviction. But also, you always think that the earlier stage investors, they are shooting from the hip. I think this is true for every stage in investing. You can ask a Series B investor, and they will think that Series A investor is shooting from the hip, and Series C investors, they lack conviction. That's one thing. It's so easy to convince yourself that at the stage you're at, if you're investing at seed or A rounds, it's so easy to convince yourself that this is the next big thing, and I want to be part of this high potential journey, even though it's high risk. But then when you look at it a year later, when it's time to raise the next round, then others don't think at all that it's that obvious that this is the next big thing, or that this company is the ones who are going to solve it. I learned a little bit about not falling too much in love with a product or an idea or one potential or one team, but trying to be a little more realistic about what will the next round of investors think. How will they determine if this is a proper Series A investment for them or not?
So how do you evaluate now new startups if you're thinking of investing on them? And this is also maybe advice for those who want to approach you, that what is important.
I have learned more and more that even if it's a cliche, it's true that the team is super, super important. I spend more and more time trying to figure out how the co-founders work together, what the relevant experience is. Have they run a startup before? That can be quite important. How are they at recruiting people? How are they at pitching to investors? Because I realize that most of the companies I invest in, they will definitely need to raise quite a few more rounds. So they need to be good at pitching to later stage investors as well. I think initially I was more focused on the product and the solution, and the product market fit. But I have come to realize that teams are really, really important. That's definitely one advice to early stage founders. Think about sort of the completeness of the team. Maybe you need a third co-founder who has more experience from something that you're lacking. If you're a deep tech company, of course, you need strong scientific expertise somehow, or technical expertise in the business. But you will always need the sort of startup / commercial experience as well. By that, I don't mean someone who just worked with selling stuff before, because sometimes I feel that technical co-founders think of commercial as one thing, and assuming that everyone is good at selling, they're good at everything related to commercialization and raising money and recruiting. But it's really different things. So understanding how to run a business is not the same thing as being a commercial co-founder. You have to understand how to recruit people, how to maintain them, how to pitch to investors. There's lots of things related to operations as well that might also be. I mean, someone in the team has to like doing the operations. There are so many different aspects, but of course, it all depends a lot on what kind of business you're running. But really think about the completeness of the team, and think about the skills that you're lacking. Are they so crucial to the business that there should be co-founder with this skill, or is it enough to recruit someone who has more of a senior role in the company with this skill, or could it be an advisor even? It's not always clear to me how much of that skill you need on a daily basis, and how much could be as an advisor. But I think you as a co-founder should probably understand it better. So that's one advice: focus on the team.
With 50 company, there must be so many stories, a lot of drama, a lot of successes and failures. You want to share some of that?
There are quite a lot of failures, for sure. Some of the worst ones, I'm not sure the entrepreneurs want me to speak too openly about it.
Maybe if you can do it anonymously. The point is here to learn and not repeat the mistakes, and if you can sort of pick the wisdom from there.
I could definitely do it on an aggregated level because I've seen enough of them, I think. A very, very common mistake is to be way too focused on the product itself, and not being enough focused on the value that you're actually creating for the customer and understanding the customer needs. I mean, I understand this is something that's been repeated quite a few times, but I mean, I have to stress it again. I've seen it so many times in my own companies. And I guess that goes partly back to myself, that I've been too focused also on the investing in teams that have a good product. Maybe I myself haven't understood the market need enough. So I'm definitely not saying that it's the fault of entrepreneurs only, it's also the investors. But that's a very, very common thing. I've been pretty lucky in not seeing too many like co-founder dramas. But I know that there are, I mean, I have a few of those in my portfolio, and there are quite some investor friends of mine who have more. But I guess my focus on the team, especially on the last few years, has hopefully led me to companies where the co-founder team is more stable.
You've been doing good as well. There's been some initiatives. I understood you've been trying to help free someone from prison, and you've been also pledging a bit of your money to other causes.
Yeah, I mean, I that was actually how I got to know my co-founders for Online Pizza initially. That we were both active in the campaign for a Swedish citizen who was a journalist. He was born in Eritrea, but lived in Sweden, was a Swedish citizen. But then he returned to Eritrea to help start a newspaper there. But then just a few days or a week after 9/11, 2001, the president in Eritrea decided to become a dictator. So he closed all media, imprisoned all the journalists and opposition politicians. And almost all of them have been in jail since then. So that's almost 20 years ago now. And this journalist, David Isaac, he's still imprisoned. there are quite some signs that he's one of the few people who are still alive in the Eritrean prisons. And at the time when we started working on or learning about this case in 2004, he was, and maybe still is, the only European citizen that Amnesty adopted as a prisoner of conscience. There might be a few more now, but so from that perspective, that the case was quite unique and should have received a lot of attention. And what we realized was that we didn't know about this case. This was about 3 years after he was imprisoned, which we thought was weird. But if there is a Swedish citizen and journalist imprisoned without a trial for 3 years, why don't we read about that every day? Why don't we hear politicians talk about it? Why isn't that a big thing for Swedish government or European Union? And we managed to learn that people didn't know about it. So we spent some time trying to inform people about this. Started working with his brother who lived in Gothenburg, trying to spread the word about it and get media attention, get politicians to act. After about a year of doing that, luckily the major newspapers started picking it up, and so there were other freedom of press organizations in Sweden that picked it up and started running the campaigns. But that was how we got to know my co-founders initially. So we had worked together on that, also bootstrapping as students. So that was one of the things that sort of has learning about how politics works by being not involved in politics directly, but trying to affect politicians to run things, and understanding why hasn't media been writing about this? Well, because he is black and it's a country far away from Sweden. That was the honest truth that we heard from the major newspapers in Sweden, why it didn't focus on this case. If it would have a Swedish name, white skin, and it would have been in Russia, then we're pretty sure that he would be top of the agenda every day. It was kind of depressing to learn about how reality works, naive students as us were at the time. But at least it led to EU and the Swedish government actually engaging in it. From one perspective, it's still a failure because he's imprisoned. But from our perspective, the most important thing was to get bigger organizations with more better networks and more money and political power to start running the campaign instead of us. We couldn't do that much, we felt at the time. And of course, it led to us starting a business. So that was also something good that came up from it.
And that leads us to the founder's pledge, does it, basically? Now we have sort of closed the loop. How do you start this business and went to the angel investing as well? But, so you have to now do something with the money, and you have pledged something.
Founders Pledge is an organization that approached me a few years after they were started. So Founders Pledge is an organization that helps founders and investors to do good even before they have liquidity, which sounds weird, but they do it in the shape of a pledge where you as a founder promise, and you're legally bound to by signing a pledge agreement. You promise to, when you have an exit, works for investors as well, when you have an exit from your portfolio, then you promise to invest a certain percentage that you decide of your exit proceeds to charity. You decide yourself to what charities, you decide yourself how much. I think there's a minimum threshold of a few percent, but you can do anything from a few percent up to 100% if you want to. It's up to you. And by signing that pledge, you become a part of the Founders Pledge community, consisting of all other founders and investors who also care about philanthropy and doing good. So, I mean, at the basic level, it's a pledge, but it's really more about building the community and you meeting other people, and you also get to meet like very early stage charities who have like good traction, but still early days, and maybe you as a philanthropist want to support them in the early days, so they could show and get metrics that what they're doing is really effective. And the way Founders Pledge work is that when it's time to donate, they have their own research team. They're also working with external research team on trying to figure out which are the best charities that you can donate to, given your own criteria. They're very much experts in understanding the charity landscape and how to convert one donated dollar into real value for the world. And that basically follows the effective altruism idea of trying to do as much good as possible for a certain input. And I've been supporting them since I heard of them, and trying to help them sort of get going in the Nordics, especially in Sweden. I can really recommend them. This sounds like a sales pitch, but I think it's worth it. It's worth it because they're really that good and expiring.
I think it is a sales pitch. There's also the counter argument, just to take another point of view. So you're saying that you cannot allocate the money better and do more good with doing it by yourself, maybe investing to some startup companies, or you just take the portfolio view?
It's a good question because it's really a big debate in effective altruism, and Founders Pledge are working a lot of this as we speak on how to balance between doing long-term investments, growing the capital, and donating later, compared to donating to the best charities today. And that mathematical model, how to model the value of doing investments today, is quite hard. There are strong indications that at least some of the money should be invested long term. Not so much because we expect that the value of the money will grow so much faster than the value that's created by donating today, but rather that we learn so much every year from how to use the money, the donated money, into creating value. The effective altruism movement is still very young and learning a lot every year, and we expect that like in 10 years, maybe we're twice as good at converting donated dollars into value. That's a strong reason why it might be good to invest instead of donating today. But the research on this topic is definitely far from clear yet, and it's still going on. It's kind of hard to know at this point. I'm doing both, obviously. I'm not investing only to donate everything later, but I'm also investing to learn and to have a lot of fun while doing it. So I try to balance between doing the investments and donating as well. But it's hard. It's a hard question, and it will definitely be up for debate for many years ahead. We might still not come to a strict conclusion on what is best. What is clear, though, is that if everyone would only invest their money and there would be no donations to creating value today, that would not be good. But there is a strong reason to believe that investing some of the money could probably lead to even higher value creation in 10 or 20 years.
You've been also doing something for the startup community by means of documents, startup tools. What was the reason behind, and can you explain briefly what it's about?
Right. So that was one of the learnings when I started doing my own angel investments back in 2013. I realized that when I was about to invest in a company, I couldn't figure out myself what are decent terms to invest on. And it didn't seem like anyone else knew either. I started asking around a lot, what are normal terms in the seed round in Sweden? And I got a lot of different answers. So I started more or less crowdsourcing different term sheets from seed rounds and realized that there were a few terms that existed in all the term sheets, and there were a few ones that were sort of very odd compared to the other term sheets. So I summarized this, picked everything that seemed to be more or less common, and said that, okay, now I have my own term sheet. This is a normal term sheet. It's not founder friendly, it's not investor friendly, but it's balanced. So it's basically both investor and founder friendly in that sense. I started using that, but realized very quickly that, okay, now I crowdsource this. Why don't I share this with others so others can use it as well? I put it online, and it gained some traction. And it led me very quickly to understand that it's not enough to only have the term sheet. You also want the investment agreement and the shareholders agreement that correspond to the headline terms in the term sheet. So I started working with a lawyer in Sweden to develop these agreements, put them online, started receiving even more traction and more questions about other kinds of documents. Entrepreneurs wanted employment agreements and agreements for stock options and NDAs, convertibles. So I realized that, okay, I should probably spend some time working with lawyers to create these standardized, balanced templates and put them online. So I spent some time doing that, and it's all for free. The lawyers are working for free in exchange for exposure in the documents. So they basically get leads from companies who want help with the documents. And it started in Sweden, but now it's also in the rest of the Nordics. So the latest launch was in Finland in December, together with SeriesSeed.fi. And I now have some plans to grow this into a sustainable business. Today, it's fully supported by my personal money that goes into the project to pay for everything. But I think, like most charities, many of them would be better off if they also had some sort of revenue model, so it would at least be sustainable and not dependent on too much donations. That's the plan for Starter Tools, to try to keep it going, to make sure that it can keep delivering like balanced, standardized documents for at least the Nordic startup ecosystem, but hopefully more in Europe as well.
I think one of the exceptional things when I first, some years back, learned about startup tools was that you were also checking the taxation, which is not usually the case. Lawyers are so good with the legal stuff, but they don't want to bother with the taxation, and that's very important in the Scandinavian Nordics because of the high taxation, and sometimes the laws are not exactly on the side of the founder when you're doing exit, so you do some kind of transactions and giving incentives for employees as well. That you may have some consequences in the taxation perspective, and those may not be reflected in the contracts.
So this is something that's bothered me for a while, that lawyers tend to be experts in one field. So either you're a tax expert, and then you only know tax, but you're usually not that good at like understanding a startup journey and understanding how to adapt contracts to them. You only know the tax rules, or you're expert in something else, but you don't know tax. So that makes it difficult for founders who might not be able to afford having several different lawyers coming in and working on helping them. But as an entrepreneur, when you've been through some of that, then at least you learn where is it important to think about the tax consequences. I could then sort of support entrepreneurs via Starter Tools by having tax experts taking a look at a few specific areas where I know that it can be tricky for founders, especially when it comes to taxations for receiving value from the company, either in terms of like options or founders with vesting and so on, that are traditionally more risky areas than, for example, a sales agreement or an NDA.
Where is Trellis Road?
Trellis Road is it's a good question. Where is it? It's a place in the future where we have. Oh, sorry, I can't explain that one. Sorry, I have to cut this away.
No, I think we're gonna put it in. This is so sweet.
Oh, that's a good one. Where is Trellis Road? I love that question. What is Trellis Road? Trellis is the company that I started with my now co-founder, Anna Ottosson. She was running a company that I invested in myself before. They were doing a sort of deep tech B2B solution for distribution of data in the internet. So very different from food tech that we are now focusing on.
Pizza again.
Pizza is food, but pizza is not that much food tech. Online delivery is food tech. But we focus on the impact aspects. We started talking slightly more than a year ago about doing something together. Yet again, I thought that maybe I'm about to start my own company again, a real startup, but realized that it probably wasn't the right timing for many different reasons. But, we started talking about doing something together, and we had both been through sort of starting a company, exiting a company, started thinking about what to do next. We're in similar personal situation as well. I had just had my first baby, and was about to have our first baby. So we both had started thinking more about our legacy as well to the next generation. And we just concluded that we have to work on something that really reasons with us, that aligns with our passions. It sounds like a cliche, but like when you are in the luxury situation that we both were, not being dependent on a daytime job, you really have the luxury to start thinking about what is my passion. We both concluded that sort of we want to feel that we help improving the world somehow, as a combination of impact, but also startups. We know both worlds, and we see that there's a huge overlap that I think traditionally has been a bit neglected. The overlap between high impact and high profitability. I think 5 to 10 years ago, investors at least thought that you had to choose between impact and profitability. But I think it has been obvious that it's definitely possible to build huge businesses that combine the both, where one unit of economic growth in the company also generates one more unit of impact. I mean, looking at the food industry that we decided to focus on, you have like Swedish Oatly, for example, that replacing milk with oat drinks. They've been growing tremendously and aiming at 10 billion IPO now in May, I think. You have Beyond Meat with the plant-based burger replacements, who did an IPO in US. So there are some of those cases that are now went all the way to an IPO, and there are much more coming. So we definitely see that this is a great area for entrepreneurs and early stage investors to focus on. We also looked into a few different areas before deciding on food tech. We looked at the energy sector, for example, but realized very quickly that to make a big dent in the energy sector, you need a lot of money. It's quite dependent on big corporates, and it's quite dependent on policies. And we didn't really want to be dependent on those things. We thought that we want to find some area where you can make more of an impact as a small startup and the small investors, and realize that food tech is that space. There are a lot of things happening in food tech, both on research level, but also on commercialization level, that shows that even small startups can have a path to become huge without being too dependent on policies or big corporates letting them grow. You can compete as a startup. I think it's partly because of the consumer focus of food. In the end, there is a consumer that's going to eat the food. Everything along the food value chain, all the way from agriculture to packaging and e-commerce, is to take the consumer into account. And if consumers start changing behavior, if they start being attracted by new brands, for example, then sort of that trickles down all the way down to agriculture in the end. That's a way for startups to affect the whole industry without being too dependent on external factors.
So is this a journey you're planning to do as you go, or is there some big idea already behind it?
I mean, if you ask me in 5 years, I'll tell you there was a excellent strategy in how to become what we have become in 5 years. But I mean, like most other things, I have to admit that it's like it started out as we decided that last year we should spend at learning as much as possible. I had spent some time in food tech, but not high impact in any way. That was online food delivery. So I didn't really know how the sort of the high impact aspects of the food industry work today. We didn't have the networks in that niche. We didn't have the connections with the entrepreneurs that we wanted to invest in either. So we had to spend a lot of time just learning about the space and finding the entrepreneurs, finding investors, finding the experts. So we decided to spend last year investing our own money in high impact food tech startups at seed stage, alongside bigger investors who've been in the space for longer. That was a way for us to learn. We did about 7 investments last year, 50 to 100K tickets, US dollars, that is, just as a way to learn. And now I'd say that we have learned a lot. We have realized that this is sort of the perfect space to focus on from our perspective, both as small investors, but also from an impact perspective. The more we learn about the food industry, the more we learn that it's really one of the few key areas to reducing the negative effects of climate change and human health. Can be radically improved by the food system as well. So it's a super interesting area from both of those aspects. And we also seen that it's definitely doable to change things from the startup perspective, which was also one of our assumptions. We're going to spend all our time on food tech. We are thinking about how to leverage that more than just investing our money in super small tickets. But that's still up for discussion, what it will look like. We have spoken to a few other individuals and organizations that are also doing their own direct investments. So we're thinking that maybe we should start working together somehow, pooling the money perhaps. But it's still too early to tell. I'll probably have a great start in a few years on exactly why we chose a certain path. But right now, it's still a bit up on the air. What we do know is that, this is happening. We definitely see that food tech is changing the world to the better. It could be faster. We think we can help accelerate it. So we should definitely sort of be active and do a lot of investments in the space. That will be great, both from an impact perspective and financial perspective, if we don't mess up. But it's too early to tell exactly what the best model is. But we definitely want to jump on that train before it leaves.
What is your favorite word?
Oh, my favorite word. It's serendipity. I love that word for many years. Ever since I went into the best ice cream bar in the world, I think, in New York on Manhattan. There's an ice cream bar called Serendipity, which I didn't understand the word by then, but I thought it sounded funny to say. Serendipity. Just taste it. It's so fun to say. And then when I realized that it means like happy coincidence, I just sort of fell in love with it. I wanted to name my own company Serendipity when I started investing, but then I realized there was another investor in Stockholm named Serendipity, so I couldn't do it. And I was like frustrated for days that I couldn't use the word serendipity. But at least I get to say it here. That's fun.
What is your least favorite word?
I don't think I have one. I tend to dislike negativity, so I guess maybe like the word no is something I usually don't like to hear. I don't like the idea of like limitations or negativity or like obstructions to people who want to be creative but are limited by other people or by systems, like stopping things. I guess no is a word that symbolizes that. I also think we tend to, as individuals, we tend to value negative consequences of actions higher than positive consequences. So even if an action has, like in total, positive consequences, humans are likely to oppose it if there are also obvious negative consequences or risk, especially if the negative consequences come first. I've been so frustrated the last, more and more, but especially like the last year or so when I spent more time in food tech and realized how, even though I do claim and think that startups can really make a difference by being innovative and creative, but I still get so frustrated every time I see that there are big corporates or politicians trying to stop creativity, trying to stop the future from happening. There was a tweet not long ago from the French Minister of Agriculture when he read about that Singapore was the first country in the world to open up for cultivated meat, lab-grown meat, to be sold to consumers. Then his first gut reaction was to go to Twitter and say, "This will never happen in France, not under my watch." meat will always be natural for animals and never be grown in the lab. I think it's just such a tragic attitude that the new things cannot happen because, well, you should ask him why. But the French are known for protecting their farmers. So just by protecting like an old industry that we know is in many ways crazy for especially for the climate, it's just tragic. Sorry, that was a long rant on the word no.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I really get excited when I'm around people who are intellectually honest and sort of have the curiosity and energy to question their own beliefs. I think intellectual dishonesty is increasing, or at least it's become more apparent lately with the filter bubbles on social media and access to sort of the information and the quote unquote facts that you prefer yourself. I still sort of, maybe that makes me appreciate even more when people obviously are willing to question their beliefs and not making up their mind too quickly, but showing the willingness to listen to contradictory information. There's a model I heard about not long ago that's called strong opinion weakly held, which basically means that you try to make up your mind early in a certain topic, which helps you structure your thinking about it. And if you wake up in the middle of the night with a gun to your head, you know what your decision or your thought is. But the opinion itself is very weakly held, which means that you can always be changed when new information appears. And if you convince yourself that this is my approach, then I think it's easier to accept that, yes, of course, I do have opinions, but they are also they are changeable. I've been using that more and more the last few weeks, and since I heard about it, and I think it helps. It really helps structure your thinking and being more open to changing your mind.
What turns you off?
But that has to be the opposite. Sorry, boring answer. But I mean, when people are not curious and don't want to learn or improve things, just like lazy and happy with status quo. I mean, partly that's a good thing that sort of from a happiness perspective that you can be happy with what you have. That's great, and I practice that a lot. And you should definitely try to do that. But only doing that and not being curious, not trying to learn, that really turns me off.
What is your favorite curse word?
It has to be Swedish fan, which basically means, well, it means the devil, but I guess more translated it means like fuck or something. I'm not sure if I use it that much, but it feels like easiest to say when you ask for a curse word.
What sound or noise do you love?
It has to be my 1-year-old daughter laughing. I guess this is a cliche as well, but that's just irresistible. Yeah.
What sound or noise do you hate?
I mean, I really love my daughter, but like when she wakes up at 5 a.m. In the morning and I hear her say, "Daddy, play," and I know that it's going to be impossible to get her to fall asleep again. I mean, hearing that it's not what I'm looking for.
What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
It has to be something where I can like use both my body and my brain and create something, see something being built, like baker or building furniture. But it has to be baker. I enjoy bread more than furniture.
What profession would you not like to do?
Definitely politician. I mean, there are probably lots of them, but top of my head, being a politician. I mean, just looking at politics taking place in a 100-person startup, that's more than enough for me. I really hate when things are not focusing on like rational improving things, or if people are not focused on meritocracy, where the best ideas wins or the best facts wins, but you start like running politics either in an organization, but I mean, I think that's just politics on a higher level when you become a real politician. I spent some time trying to figure out how politics works, and I can't even imagine what it would be like to spending my days working with that in practice.
If you could be a co-founder of any startup in any era, which one would you choose?
One of the ideas I had when I came out from my own business and started thinking about a new business, which I still haven't seen happen, and I'm happy to give that idea away. It's tricky to execute, but I really want to start a startup or see someone start a startup. I'm happy to fund it. Ping me if you're starting this. It's like the health tech startup that somehow is able to collect lots and lots of global, anonymous, of course, health records, including like personal background, symptoms, diagnosis, treatments, results from those treatments, long-term effects, and ideally also collect like DNA, regularly measured blood tests, poo samples, like everything that we today think is important to the health of an individual. And if you can get access to all that data, then by applying machine learning, I'm pretty sure that we could create virtual doctors that are much better than anything we can imagine today. And by doing that, we would also be much better to proactively realize that something is going on or soon going on in a human being, and be able to sort of prevent that before it even becomes a disease. I think that would be a major leap forward in terms of human health, and would probably improve humanity as a whole a lot. So I'd like to start that startup.
Any final words for the audience?
If you are thinking about starting a startup, like do it. It's always easy to sit around like I am doing or have been doing for a few years, trying to sort of wait for the perfect moment. But if you have the opportunity to do it, and especially if you're still quite young, maybe you're still studying, maybe you have somehow secured your personal financial situation, then even if you don't have the perfect idea, it doesn't really matter. You can do it just for learning. And then when you have the perfect idea, maybe it's easier for you to make the decision. So just do it.
Thank you, Erik. This discussion has made me hungry.
Thank you, Petri. Me too. Let's have a pizza.
Thanks for listening. Before we go, could you do me a favor and share this episode with one person you think could benefit from it? This helps to get the word out and reach more founders that might benefit from the discussions. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.